The moment my teacher laughed at my answer, the room decided who I was, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't supposed to be right. I was 12 years old, sitting in the third row of Harrington Academy, a private school so polished it felt like even mistakes were expensive. The desks were carved wood, the kind you didn't scratch without permission. Nameplates shined under fluorescent lights. The walls were lined with framed diplomas, portraits of former principals, and quiet reminders that greatness here had a certain look. I didn't match it. My sweater came from a thrift store 3 bus rides away. The sleeves were slightly too short, the fabric softened by years of someone else's winters. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers pressed together so tightly they ached. I'd learned early that stillness was safer than attention. I was the only black student in that classroom. Mrs. Caldwell stood at the front, chalk between her fingers, posture straight, voice trained to command silence without asking for it. She had the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. Pearls rested against her blouse. Her hair didn't move when she turned her head. "Who can tell me," she said, tapping the board once, "why the Treaty of Versailles failed?" Hands flew up like it was a competition. Blonde hands, confident hands, hands that had never been taught to doubt themselves. I didn't raise mine, I never did, but her eyes found me anyway. "Yes," she said, pointing lightly. "You go ahead." My stomach dropped so fast it felt like I'd missed a step on the stairs. Every head turned. I could feel it before I saw it. The shift, the curiosity, the quiet excitement of watching someone else be put on the spot. I swallowed. "Well," I said carefully, measuring every word, "the treaty failed because it punished Germany without stabilizing the economy, which made extremist ideas feel like hope instead of danger." For a half-second, there was nothing. Then Mrs. Caldwell laughed, not surprised, not amused, dismissive. "Oh my," she said, shaking her head slightly like I'd tried to be clever and failed. "That's ambitious." The class followed her lead. Laughter rolled across the room, chairs creaked, someone snorted. A boy near the window whispered something and covered his mouth. I felt heat crawl up my neck, into my face, behind my eyes. Mrs. Caldwell smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's a very simplified answer," she said. "Almost cute." Cute. I stared at my notebook so no one would see the tears fighting to break loose. Crying would only confirm what they already believed, that I didn't belong here, that I was pretending, that I should be grateful just to be in the room. "Real historians," she continued, turning back to the board, "understand that global failures can't be reduced to emotional reasoning." She paused, then added lightly, "Perhaps you should rely on the textbook next time." More laughter. I pressed my fingernails into my palm until it hurt enough to keep me grounded. Don't cry. Don't speak. Don't give her anything else to take. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my answer didn't come from guessing. It came from years of listening. From a home where history wasn't neat or flattering, where stories were passed down in quiet voices at night, where consequences mattered more than dates. And it was right. I just didn't know yet that this laugh, this moment, was the beginning of everything. Humiliation doesn't always end when the laughter stops. Sometimes it waits. Mrs. Caldwell didn't acknowledge what she'd done. She never looked back at me, never softened her voice, never offered the kind of pause that says maybe I went too far. She moved on like my embarrassment was just another lesson completed. Now, she said, tapping the board again, let's hear from someone who actually prepared. Her eyes passed over me and landed on Evan Whitmore in the front row. Evan's hand shot up before she finished the sentence. His confidence filled the room. He had the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned at home or school. His last name was stitched into this building, on plaques, on donation lists, on banners that celebrated generosity while ignoring who paid the price. "Yes, Evan," Mrs. Caldwell said, her tone warm, almost proud. Evan leaned back in his chair and spoke clearly. "The treaty failed because it crippled Germany economically," he said, "which created instability and allowed extremist ideologies to grow." My chest tightened. It was my answer. Not exactly word for word, but close enough that I felt something inside me split open. Mrs. Caldwell smiled. "Excellent," she said. "Very insightful analysis." The class murmured approval. A few students nodded. Someone whispered, "Smart." I stared straight ahead, afraid to blink. Then she looked at me, not with apology, with satisfaction. "You see the difference?" she asked the class. No one responded. "Delivery matters," she continued lightly. "Clarity matters. Academic discipline matters." A few students laughed again, quieter this time, but sharper. I pressed my fingers against the edge of my desk, feeling the smooth wood beneath my nails. Don't react, don't give her anything else. But she wasn't finished. "Sometimes," Mrs. Caldwell added, erasing the board slowly, "students confuse opinions they've heard at home with legitimate scholarship." The room went still. That sentence wasn't about history, it was about me. I felt eyes slide toward me, not amused now, but curious. Measuring. As if everyone was suddenly wondering where I came from, what kind of home could produce an answer like that. I wanted to disappear. The bell rang soon after, loud and abrupt. Chairs scraped back. Conversations resumed instantly as if nothing important had happened. Students poured into the hallway, already replacing this moment with lunch plans and weekend trips. I stayed seated. Mrs. Caldwell erased the rest of the board, chalk dust floating through the sunlight. She looked calm, untouched. As I stood to leave, her voice stopped me. "Stay for a moment." My stomach sank. The classroom emptied. The door clicked shut behind the last student, sealing us inside the silence. Mrs. Caldwell turned to face me, arms crossed. "You're clearly capable," she said, measured and cool. "But capability without humility becomes arrogance." Arrogance. "I suggest," she continued, "that you remember where you are. Opportunities like Harrington aren't common for students like you." She didn't have to explain what she meant. I nodded because I didn't yet know how to do anything else. "Yes, ma'am," I said quietly. She dismissed me with a small wave of her hand. Out in the hallway, my legs shook so badly I had to lean against the lockers. Students passed me in clusters, laughing, brushing past my shoulder without noticing. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath all day and forgotten how to let it go. That's when I noticed her. A woman standing a few feet away, dressed sharply in a dark suit. She wasn't talking. She wasn't on her phone. She was watching me. Our eyes met. She didn't look away. There was no pity in her expression, no curiosity either, just recognition. She glanced toward Mrs. Caldwell's classroom door, then back at me, her jaw tightening slightly. In that moment, standing alone in a hallway that suddenly felt too long, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. Someone had seen it. All of it, and whatever came next, this wasn't over. That night, I didn't tell my mother what happened, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I didn't know how to explain the kind of humiliation that doesn't leave bruises. Our apartment sat above a laundromat on the east side of town. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the air always smelled faintly of detergent and warm metal. It wasn't much, but it was steady, safe, honest. My mother was at the kitchen table when I came in, glasses sliding down her nose, stacks of papers spread in front of her. She was grading essays from her evening class at the community center. Yes, my mother was a teacher too, just not the kind Harrington Academy admired. "How was school?" she asked without looking up. "Fine," I said. She paused. Mothers know when that word is lying. I went to my room, dropped my bag by the door, and lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow, uneven circles. Mrs. Caldwell's laughter replayed in my head, sharper each time. Cute, simplified, opinions heard at home. She had no idea how close to the truth she'd come. History lived in our house, not the polished version that fit neatly into chapters and tests, the real one. The kind that arrived through stories, through warnings, through lessons whispered late at night when the world felt too heavy. When I was younger, my mother used to braid my hair before bed. Her fingers moved with rhythm and patience, and while she worked, she talked. Not about fairy tales. About her grandfather, who fled the South after being threatened for trying to vote. About her mother, who cleaned houses for families who smiled at her face and erased her presence the moment she turned away. About laws that promised fairness and delivered harm. "History isn't about dates," my mother would say softly. "It's about consequences, about who gets to walk away and who doesn't." That was how I learned, not from memorization, from survival. When Harrington Academy accepted me on scholarship, everyone called it a miracle. A door opening, a chance to rise. What no one said out loud was that doors can slam shut just as fast, especially when you forget your place. Later that night, my mother knocked gently on my door. "You sure you're okay?" she asked. I hesitated. Then the truth spilled out of me like it had been waiting all day. I told her about the question, the laughter, Evan. The way Mrs. Caldwell said students like you as if it explained everything. My mother didn't interrupt. She listened the way she always did, fully, completely, without preparing a response while I spoke. When I finished, she reached for my hand. "You weren't wrong," she said quietly. "I know," I whispered, "but it didn't matter." She leaned back in her chair, eyes tired but steady. "Sometimes," she said, "people in power aren't afraid of being wrong, they're afraid of where the truth comes from." She stood, walked to the old bookshelf in the corner, and pulled down a thick binder with frayed edges. The cover was soft from years of handling. She placed it on my bed and opened it. Inside were essays, research papers, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes in the margins. Names I'd never seen in my textbooks, scholars who never made it into the curriculum. "This," my mother said, "is what your grandmother left me." I turned the pages slowly, my chest tightening. "She studied history on her own," my mother continued, "because no one would teach it to her the way she needed to learn it." I looked up. "Why didn't you ever tell me all this?" She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Because knowledge like this makes people uncomfortable," she said. "And uncomfortable people can be dangerous." The next morning, I walked into school carrying more than my backpack. I carried every voice that had been dismissed before mine. In history class, Mrs. Caldwell stood at the front like nothing had happened. But something was different. In the back of the room sat the woman from the hallway, notebook open, pen moving, watching. Mrs. Caldwell asked another question. The room waited. And this time I raised my hand. When I raised my hand, the room noticed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confident. It was deliberate, quiet, almost hesitant, but it was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Caldwell paused mid-sentence. Her eyes flicked toward me, registering surprise, maybe even irritation. Then, with practiced calm, she said, "Yes." My heart thumped in my chest. I thought of my mother, of the binder, of every story I had ever been told that never made it into textbooks. "I have a question," I said. The students shifted in their seats. Evan's eyes narrowed, curious. A few others leaned slightly forward. Mrs. Caldwell's smile tightened. "Go on," I drew a breath. "Yesterday, you dismissed my answer because you said it relied on emotional reasoning instead of academic rigor. Today, Evan gave almost the same answer, and you called it insightful." The air in the classroom grew thick. Students exchanged glances. Some leaned back, some froze. Mrs. Caldwell's smile became strained. "Your point." "The content was identical," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "So the difference wasn't academic, it was something else." A murmur ran through the room. The students were noticing now, some for the first time, that perhaps things weren't fair. Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed together. Her posture stiffened. "Are you suggesting bias?" "I'm asking for clarification," I said. "Because historians like Keynes and Marx argued the same point. My answer wasn't an opinion, it was evidence-based." The woman at the back of the room stopped writing. She looked up, attentive. Mrs. Caldwell's voice grew sharper. "You're being disruptive. Sit down." I didn't. "I'm not trying to be disruptive," I said. "I'm trying to understand why the same answer is treated differently depending on who delivers it." Silence fell, not the silence of shock, not laughter. A heavy, charged silence. Mrs. Caldwell stepped closer. "You're on scholarship," she said quietly, but just loud enough to reach everyone. "Be careful not to confuse confidence with entitlement." I held my gaze. I didn't flinch. Then a calm, firm voice broke the tension. "Excuse me," said the woman at the back. Every head turned. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "This is a closed classroom," she said. "I'm aware," the woman replied, "which is why I've been observing." She pulled out a badge from her jacket pocket. "I'm Dr. Elaine Porter, Board of Academic Standards. I came to review classroom practices." The room went dead silent. Mrs. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed, her authority suddenly fragile. Dr. Porter looked at the class. "I heard the answers given yesterday, and I heard the answers today." She turned to Mrs. Caldwell. "Would you like to explain why identical answers were judged differently?" Mrs. Caldwell faltered. She had no words. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't shrink. I stood tall, carrying every story, every lesson, every voice that had been ignored. Dr. Porter turned back to me. "Would you like to explain your reasoning fully?" I nodded. And for the first time that day, every word I spoke carried weight. The classroom had transformed. It wasn't just a room of students anymore, it was a stage. And truth had taken the classroom didn't breathe. It waited. Every second stretched like a taut wire. Mrs. Caldwell tried to speak. Words stumbled, faltered, died before leaving her mouth. Dr. Porter remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make demands. She simply waited, letting the silence carry the weight. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Porter said evenly, I asked you why the same answer, delivered by two different students, was judged differently. The room held its collective breath. Mrs. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly. Her chalk tapped nervously against the board. It's classroom management discipline students, Dr. Porter shook her head. This is about fairness, about the standards you claim to uphold. Then she turned to the students. Who remembers the answer yesterday? Hands rose slowly. Hesitant, some whispered. Who remembers the answer today? More hands. Some students glanced at each other, realizing the answers were identical. Were they substantially different? Dr. Porter asked. The silence was deafening. Then, quietly, Evans spoke. No. The sound of that one word carried through the room. It broke the illusion. The students' eyes flickered, registering something they hadn't before. Dr. Porter nodded. Thank you, Evan. She turned to Mrs. Caldwell. And yet one answer was praised and one dismissed. Mrs. Caldwell's shoulders stiffened. Her control was slipping. This classroom, Dr. Porter said, looking at the students, will pause instruction effective immediately. I will file a full review of teaching practices. Gasps and whispers floated through the students. No one laughed. Dr. Porter turned to me. You did nothing wrong. You spoke with integrity. Relief washed over me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Not victory, not triumph, relief. The students stayed still. Even Evan's confident posture softened. They were absorbing the moment. Seeing power questioned, authority challenged, and truth finally spoken. Mrs. Caldwell slumped in her chair. The polished armor of her authority was gone. She couldn't reclaim it in front of witnesses. Later, an announcement confirmed what we already knew. Mrs. Caldwell would be taking an extended leave. No apology, no explanation, absence that spoke louder than words. In that silence, the classroom changed. Relationships shifted. Respect surfaced where laughter had once lived. The students saw me, not just my answer, but the weight behind it, the history, the preparation, the courage. I looked at Evan. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes said it all. I had survived the laughter. I had survived the silence. And for the first time, I believed that maybe my place was exactly where I stood. The observer, the woman in the back, had her pen down now. She gave a slight nod. A recognition that I wasn't the only one who had been tested. And in that silence, I realized something. The world could laugh at your voice. It could try to silence you. But truth, carried with courage, demands attention. The classroom didn't breathe. It waited. Every second stretched like a taut wire. Mrs. Caldwell tried to speak. Words stumbled, faltered, died before leaving her mouth. Dr. Porter remained calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make demands. She simply waited, letting the silence carry the weight. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Porter said evenly, I asked you why the same answer, delivered by two different students, was judged differently. The room held its collective breath. Mrs. Caldwell's hands trembled slightly. Her chalk tapped nervously against the board. It's classroom management discipline students, Dr. Porter shook her head. This is about fairness, about the standards you claim to uphold. Then she turned to the students. Who remembers the answer yesterday? Hands rose slowly. Hesitant, some whispered. Who remembers the answer today? More hands. Some students glanced at each other, realizing the answers were identical. Were they substantially different? Dr. Porter asked. The silence was deafening. Then, quietly, Evans spoke. No. The sound of that one word carried through the room. It broke the illusion. The students' eyes flickered, registering something they hadn't before. Dr. Porter nodded. Thank you, Evan. She turned to Mrs. Caldwell. And yet one answer was praised and one dismissed. Mrs. Caldwell's shoulders stiffened. Her control was slipping. This classroom, Dr. Porter said, looking at the students, will pause instruction effective immediately. I will file a full review of teaching practices. Gasps and whispers floated through the students. No one laughed. Dr. Porter turned to me. You did nothing wrong. You spoke with integrity. Relief washed over me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Not victory, not triumph, relief. The students stayed still. Even Evan's confident posture softened. They were absorbing the moment. Seeing power questioned, authority challenged, and truth finally spoken. Mrs. Caldwell slumped in her chair. The polished armor of her authority was gone. She couldn't reclaim it in front of witnesses. Later, an announcement confirmed what we already knew. Mrs. Caldwell would be taking an extended leave. No apology, no explanation. Absence that spoke louder than words. In that silence, the classroom changed. Relationships shifted. Respect surfaced where laughter had once lived. The students saw me, not just my answer, but the weight behind it, the history, the preparation, the courage. I looked at Evan. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His eyes said it all. I had survived the laughter. I had survived the silence. And for the first time, I believed that maybe my place was exactly where I stood. The observer, the woman in the back, had her pen down now. She gave a slight nod. A recognition that I wasn't the only one who had been tested. And in that silence, I realized something. The world could laugh at your voice. It could try to silence you. But truth, carried with courage, demands attention. The hallway was quiet that afternoon. Even the usual chatter of students seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the classroom's silence. I walked out with a calm I hadn't felt before. Not arrogance, not relief, something steadier, purpose. Each step echoed the lessons I'd learned at home. Knowledge matters, integrity matters, and courage matters most of all. At home, I told my mother everything again. But this time, she smiled differently, not just proud, but deeply satisfied. You stood in your truth, she said. And that is the only way real change ever begins. Years passed, and I carried that lesson forward. I studied history, the kind that exposes injustice and celebrates voices too long ignored. I became a teacher myself, standing in classrooms, listening to questions, nurturing voices that might otherwise be silenced. Every student who trembles when they raise their hand, everyone reminds me of that day. And every time I speak up, write, or teach, I hear the echo of Mrs. Caldwell's laughter fading, replaced by the quiet recognition that truth does not ask permission. I learned that day that courage is contagious, that even in a room full of laughter and disbelief, a single voice, spoken with honesty and conviction, can command attention. And that the legacy of speaking your truth is not always immediate, but it reverberates, shaping the world long after the moment has passed. Sometimes, in a quiet classroom, when sunlight falls across the desks and the students lean in with rapt attention, I remember that 12-year-old girl who stood frozen, watching the room laugh at her knowledge. And I know that she would be proud of the woman she became. Truth, I realized, doesn't need an audience to matter. It simply needs someone brave enough to speak it. They laughed at my answer, but what silenced the room was the truth they weren't ready to hear.